Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to this webinar organized by the United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security with the Munich Re Foundation. Thank you for joining. I'll wait a minute just for other people to connect. Today we'll be talking about planned relocation at COP28 and sharing some insights from the Climate Academy that was held in September. And I have hopefully three panelists joining us. So just waiting another minute and then we'll get started. Right, so we're good to go. So I'll just share my screen with you. Oh, Himanshu, in backend, could you please allow me to share my screen?
Yes, now please.
Welcome, Caroline. Thank you for joining us. All right, so let's get started. Our topic today is plans of relocation at COP28, key lessons for national climate action. And I am joined first by Renate Bleich of the Munich Re Foundation, who will give us a few opening remarks and words of welcome, as well as three wonderful panelists. We have Caroline Jacobs from the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, Carolyn Cherub, who's joining us from Kenya. She works at the Climate Desk in the Parliament of Kenya, and Sarah Quato of the Platform on Disaster Displacement based in Geneva, Switzerland. They all participated in the Climate Academy that was organized jointly between UNU EHS and the Munich Re Foundation with the support of IOM and UNFCCC back in September. I'll hand over to Renate that she can look back to the Climate Academy back in September to give us a few opening remarks. Over to you, Renate.
Thank you, David, and good morning or good afternoon, good evening to everybody, wherever you are. Thanks for joining us for this webinar, and thanks for being here. Let me just say the Climate Academy this year, in our point of view, has been hugely successful. The Climate Academy is about, bringing academia, policymakers, and practitioners together to talk about and discuss state-of-the-art knowledge, identify knowledge gaps, and inform climate policy. And this year, the topic was community choices and planned relocation. And as I said, I think we had a very, very great group of participants together. They're very knowledgeable, very eager to support the discussion, and we're really happy with the results that we have. And one of the results we'll be talking about today, which is policy recommendations for national policymakers involved in planned relocation processes. And we have just finished the policy brief document, which we will also bring to the COP and try to present there in two side events, and hopefully get the message across on these recommendations that the group has come up with. So let me just thank all the participants again, and also all the organizations involved, the UN University, IOM, and the UNFCCC. And I'm really keen on hearing about this discussion today. And yeah, I wish you all a very informative and a great webinar. Thanks.
Thank you, Renate, for these kind words and your continued support for the Climate Academy. I see that we're also joined by Sumit Naidu from Fiji. I was hopeful but uncertain that you would join us. Thank you for joining us. And when we get to the panel discussion, I will ask you to introduce yourself and join the conversation. Thanks. But to start us off, I'll give a very brief presentation just to provide a little bit of context for our audience and to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of what our topic of conversation is and what planned relocation is in our understanding. So I'll just share my screen. Here it is. Can you see my screen? It's the wrong one, isn't it?
Not in the presentation mode, David.
Yeah, it's showing on the other. That should be better. Is that right? Perfect. Okay, perfect. All right, so the Climate Academy. Just a little bit more detail. We met for 2 weeks, one in person and one online. During the online week, 25 researchers and policymakers, practitioners shared their insights on planned relocation. And our objective, as Renata said, really was to facilitate a networking exchange and explore some collaborations and also to put together a few outputs. The first one, which we'll discuss today, was the policy brief, but we also have other things in the pipeline, a more academic commentary, and we're thinking about more long-term resources that our sort of collective of researchers and experts that participated in the academy with their wider networks could provide, such as how-to guidance, a repository on how to decide and do better on planned relocation. Together, we identified, and there are lots of definitions of planned relocation out there, but we identified a few key characteristics. These are not sort of final or definitive, but they're intended to set some parameters to the conversation within this broader field of climate mobilities, which it includes different forms, of which planned relocation is only one. So planned relocation, in our understanding and in the way we've been talking about it, is it's a collective process, so involving a whole community or neighborhood or group of people who are moving in a coordinated and planned manner. Generally, the intention of planned relocation is for it to be a permanent move, although in practice that is not always the case. And specifically, our interest and a lot of the expertise in the room was about planned relocation in anticipation or response to climate-related hazards and vulnerabilities. There are other reasons to resettle, and these are also factored into climate-related relocations, but this was our primary focus. And usually we understand planned relocation as a last resort, although that's something that we can discuss the meaning of in more detail. So that also helps us understand that planned relocation in this understanding is not an individual process, like migration decision-making can sometimes be. It's also not a temporary process in the way we think about it, and it's also not an emergency. But the exact boundaries are up for debate, and the precise definition of planned relocation will always be context sensitive. And thinking through this idea of integrating planned relocation in national climate action, that's a very important point to keep in mind. There may be different planned relocation definitions that are appropriate for different contexts. The second thing is that planned relocation is a very complex set of processes, and this is one of the reasons why there is no archetype or sort of final definition, is that within a planned relocation, you have to think about lots of different sub-processes. The image on the screen is not supposed to give you to be looked at in any detail, but merely to show you that there are several stages. Those are the columns. You start before any planned relocation happens. There needs to be some anticipation, some decision-making about whether it even is the right path forward. And once that process is put into motion, there is a lot of planning that has to happen, and then implementation, and also long-term follow-up. So there are many stages, and these involve stakeholders that can at different levels, from the local all the way to global scales. And within that, there is a need for guidelines, for funding mechanisms, for assessments, for supports of various kinds to communities. And so this is just to really highlight the complexity and why a plan relocation is very context sensitive. 2 points I do want to highlight to sort of finish off this presentation or definition is that one point that came up a lot in our discussions is that plan relocation has also often happened in the past for other, not necessarily climate-related reasons. That might have been infrastructure development, such as dams, or a colonial history of displacement. And these are also very important contextual factors to take into account in the relationships that communities have with the state and with other national actors or even non-state actors. Notably on the level of sort of trust and involvement in planning. And secondly, and to a point that's important for sort of how to talk about plan relocation in the context of the COP, it also is sort of associated or related to many different frameworks. And there are arguments for connecting it, for example, to disaster risk reduction or adaptation or loss and damage or human rights. And there are sort of valuable all of those can be valuable approaches, and we can discuss today a little bit more about where plan relocation sits and what multiple agendas it can fit into. Just a few productive tensions I've already sort of alluded to, and which we can discuss today. There's a lot of there's a tension between the extent to which plan relocation has to be sort of a last resort option that comes out as sort of at the limits of adaptation, or whether it's actually something that needs to be anticipated, and to what extent, how that's, the question is, what does that mean in practice? At what stage does plan relocation need to be considered, and so on. The second thing is the sort of binary opposition between sort of forced and voluntary relocation. It's very important to have community involvement and community decisions drive the process in our perspective, but that still leaves the question of open whether plan relocation is ever really voluntary when climate change is so negatively impacting communities. And lastly, a big point, and this is going to be central to our conversation of the role of national actors, is what kinds of support do communities require? So here are the insights. I will very briefly go through them, but we'll go in more detail into them during the panel conversation. But we came up with these based on the presentations from all the participants and sort of our collective expertise, and tried to focus on the things that policymakers, government actors who are interested in plan relocation or in integrating it in their thinking on climate mobilities, on climate action, what they should be considering as part of that process. And so the first one is that plan relocation really should be people-centered, that there's the role of communities is central to relocation planning and processes. The second is that a clear framework is very valuable and should be put into place in order to arrange and organize decision-making and planning around relocations. The third point is that plan relocation is a long-term process that requires a lot of planning and long-term commitments. As you saw in that slide with sort of the 9 boxes, the plan relocation really starts much before the actual relocation. There's a lot of planning and decision-making that has to be made. And once people have moved, there's a lot of follow-up that needs to happen. And a lot of that, And the fourth thing is there's a very commonly differences in the perceptions and assessments that communities and governments make of the risks that they face and the thresholds at which point risks become unacceptable. And this really needs to be carefully considered before decisions are made to ask communities to move, for example, by a government. And the last point is that no matter how well a plan relocation is conducted, there will always be an element of loss. And it's very important to address these economic and non-economic losses associated with plan relocation. That's it from me, just as a few words of introduction, and our panelists can also react. We'll also have an opportunity to react. And I will just say before we move into the conversation that the objective today is really to have a conversation. So feel free to post your questions in the chat. We will start by asking the panelists a couple of questions to get their perspectives. But very quickly bring in any questions from the audience as needed. And I'll stop sharing my screen to see you all again. Sorry about that. So, if possible, I would like to ask Caroline and Sumit to turn on their cameras if their internet connection allows it. And we'll start with a round of introductions. Hi, Sumit, welcome.
Bula David from Fiji.
Well, well, thank you for joining us. I would like to start by asking each of the panelists, so maybe starting with you, Sumit, to give us a very brief introduction for the audience to say who you are and what your sort of interest or expertise is on plan relocation, specifically to this question of the role of national governments. So please, over to you.
Thank you, David. Firstly, thank you for the invite. And my name is Sumit Naidu. I work as a consultant at the Climate Change Division of Fiji. Unfortunately, my colleagues who have been traveling, they're not here. They're part of the COP that starts tomorrow. So they provided the link to me, so I'm here. My expertise, I work with the adaptation team in plan relocation. So that's my expertise at the moment with the Climate Change Division, and specifically on the Communities Relocation Trust Fund, how the trust fund helps support the planned relocation in Fiji. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. And we'll have questions about this. We spoke to your colleague Filimone Alogego during the Climate Academy, and the trust fund was something we didn't have quite enough time to touch on. So we'll return to that. Next up, please, Caroline, if you'd like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about who you are and the interest that you have in planned relocation.
Hi, David. Just a second. Yes, my name is Caroline Cherop from the Parliament of Kenya. I run the climate desk at that institution. Sorry, my camera. Oh, yes, that's perfect. Yes, my interest in this is because I work with policymakers, to be specific, members of parliament. I run, I coordinate the activities of about 30 members of the Senate who are in the climate caucus. And therefore, my work is to basically bring to the fore the issues around climate disasters, climate change, climate action. And so when it comes to planned relocation, this is a phenomenon that's very prevalent in their counties, in their constituencies. And therefore, since it is something that is coming into use, it has become evident that they need information, they need research, they need data, they need to know what's happening in other countries. And so this conversation is very crucial for them. So for me, that's my interest, to actually capacity build them and let them know what's happening around the space of planned relocation. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Caroline. And we'll return to that and these motivations for action at the national level. Next, I would like to ask Caroline Jacobs from Leiden University to say a few words about her expertise.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Caroline Jacobs, Leiden University in the Netherlands. I work as an assistant professor at the university, and my work is mostly social-legal, which means that I'm interested in seeing how actually law and policy works out in practice for people, and what are the issues that people face with the implementation and the enforcement of laws and policies, and do policies actually work for people, or do people encounter problems? So that is basically the red thread throughout the research that I do. And in terms of climate migration and planned relocation, I'm especially interested in the case of Mozambique, where I've been working, where the government has, as one of its key approaches to reduce disaster risk, is basically to remove people from high-risk areas to safer areas. And that, of course, raises lots of interesting questions for me as researcher, and I'm interested in also seeing how these dynamics play out differently in other settings in terms of climate, in terms of conflict mobility, for instance. So I'm also comparing that in other contexts. Yeah.
Thank you, Karen. Yes, I think those 2 points of how does policy really play out on the ground is something we can talk about, and maybe hear a little bit about the Fijian experience as well in comparison, and also those relationships to other forms of mobility is something that we can return to. So finally, over to Sarah, just for a few words of introduction about her work at the Platform on Disaster Displacement.
Yes, thank you, David, and good morning to everyone from Geneva. My name is Sarah Kurzel, and I work as policy officer with the Platform on Disaster Displacement. The PDD was launched in 2016 to follow up on the Nansen initiative and the protection agenda that was endorsed in the process. So we are a state-led process, a platform really engaging with academics and also other partners from our advisory committee, but mainly states. Kenya and Fiji are both members of the steering group of the PDD, former and incoming chair. And the traditional focus of the Nansen initiative was the cross-border disaster displacement and the protection needs of people crossing international borders in disaster and climate change contexts. And we're in the middle of a revision of our strategy and are doing more work now on also making linkages to internal displacement and planned relocation. We've already commissioned a study and a mapping of planned relocation cases around the world, and really have to thank UNU and Munich Re Foundation for the great opportunity of the Climate Academy. That was such a rich discussion. Now you're meeting 3-4 participants from the group. We're still following up on all the ideas floated there, and very happy to be here today when the policy brief is presented ahead of COP. Thank you so much, David.
Thank you, Sarah. And yes, thank you for that note about the continued activities. And this is also an invitation to our audience. If you're interested in this topic and want to reach out and learn more and exchange with us, we are available, and we can share contact details for the Climate Academy and help connect and continue conversations and expand them. So to start, I would like to turn to Sumit and Caroline to ask you one question about why is it interesting from your perspective to consider planned relocation as a distinct process from other climate mobilities, or is that appropriate? So in the case of Fiji, the government has developed standard operating procedures, guidelines, a trust fund specifically for planned relocation. So for Sumit, the question is, could you say a little bit more about the motivation for that and why planned relocation had to be considered as a distinct process from maybe other forms of movements? And for Caroline, the question is more, since you're at a much earlier stage of discussions, is that for Kenya sort of the path forward, or is this is planned relocation being thought of as part of some broader displacement or disaster agenda? But maybe let's start with Sumit, and if you can say a few things about what led to this policy in Fiji.
Thank you, David, and thank you for posing the question. What led to these decisions is basically due to the frequency of the threats, the rapid onslaught events or slow onslaught events, mostly the rapid onslaught events that happen in extreme weather events, disasters that hit the country of Fiji. I mean, because we're the Pacific Island country and potential for disasters, we are prone to those disasters. So basically that was the main idea of developing certain guidelines to emphasize that gap in planned relocation. So the Fiji government came out in 2018, they developed a planned relocation guideline. And to beef it up, they set up a trust fund to support that guideline. And then the Climate Change Act was then enacted in 2021. And then recently this year, the Parliament endorsed the standard operating procedures. So it was a complex, like you mentioned in the beginning presentation, relocation is a complex system of relocation.
And so it's like a whole package of different legislations and tools that has been put into place, but it's also a sort of standalone. Was there any? Do you know if there was any conversation about integrating it into more of an existing disaster policy and so on, and why it was designed to be a distinct legislation and process?
So all those guidelines and activities led to a Climate Change Act, which is the ultimate guideline, ultimate Climate Change Act that was established 2021. And then that Climate Change Act provides provides the legal mandate to ministries in terms of implementing certain activities, because planned relocation is a multifaceted interagency collaboration. So in efforts to have that, the Climate Change Act provides that mandate. And then the standard operating procedures of communities is where the guidelines are clearly defined how planned relocation has to happen. So it took Fiji a while to come up with those guidelines, and it's an effective and workable guideline. It's a consultative process. Everyone is involved, right down to the communities, to state, and to governments, basically. So governments working together through that process, helping communities relocate. And in order for that to happen, Fiji government decided to create a specific trust fund, so that the trust fund's purpose is specifically for the planned relocation communities in Fiji.
Okay, thank you. Caroline, if you're with us, could you say a few words about the case of Kenya and where you see planned relocation fits within current discussions and agendas? Is it something that you anticipate to be a standalone or separate process, or is it going to be integrated in your understanding to other agendas?
All right, thank you, David. I'll just pose the question: why involve governments in the first place? I mean, if something is coming affecting a community, why can't the community just get up and leave? Have their autonomy to make their decision. But involving governments involving governments in planned relocation is very much an integrated process, especially in the context of climate change. This is because governments have access to resources, both financial and logistical. They're essential for large-scale relocation efforts. And also this process, as we have just talked about, it's a very complex matter that requires a robust legal and policy frameworks. And so governments are responsible for creating and enforcing laws and policies that protect the rights of those who are being relocated, and ensuring that there is fair compensation, and also addressing the key issue of land tenure issues. Because colleagues, you'll remember during our conversation in Senegal, how we were able to look at all these case studies and realizing that and as much as we're saying that this planned relocation is usually a solution of a last resort of some kind, governments, communities should evidently be involved in that decision, that they have autonomy of what they decide. So when it comes to planned relocation, it's in this context, it's very crucial that we involve multiple sectors and stakeholders, communities being at the center of it, and governments are able to be to coordinate these efforts and ensure that these plans are comprehensive, inclusive, and integrated into the broader development and climate adaptation strategies. So yes, David, this is not a standalone process.
Mhm.
It has to be multifaceted.
Mhm.
So yes, I'd like to leave it there, unless there's another question, David. Thank you.
There's something in common also with this sort of approach
Yes.
of many actors being brought together, even
Renewable.
within the sort of government level.
And David, just a
Yeah.
minute. As you say that, it reminds me of what is currently happening in my country, where there's the issue of flooding as a result of El Nino. And what we are experiencing right now is that communities are actually moving because of the flooding that is affecting them. And so government has had to step in and actually find a solution. And finally, I mean, evidently they are looking for ways to entrench this family in policy. And as I mentioned during our meeting, our time in Senegal, that Kenya doesn't have a comprehensive policy on this. We have a national disaster strategy or policy on the matter, but we do not have a legislative or a proposal, and the proposal that is already being worked on wasn't comprehensive enough to cover planned relocation. So I think it is time. It is coming to us, I guess. Thank you, David.
So in that way, I understand is that talking about planned relocation allows also to have that conversation about long-term lasting solutions for people displaced,
Exactly.
and not focusing purely on the
short term
moment and immediate aftermath. Is that
yes. Yes, exactly.
Maybe turning over now to Caroline and Sarah, does that bring up any immediate reactions? What you've heard? Is there maybe to this question that Caroline posed? You know, why involve national governments? What role do they have to play in this? Caroline mentioned sort of frameworks and supports and land rights. Maybe Caroline, do you have any reactions about the role of government in your experience?
Yeah, I can reflect on that. I think those are very important points. And if we think about involving and sort of how the government can sort of help local communities, there's one thing which I think is often overlooked, and that is that there's a lot of attention for people who are relocated. And many governments, in many countries, constitutions say, for instance, all land belongs to the state. So basically, the state is also able to designate land which is suitable for relocation. And such land maybe formally is vacant. But in practice, I think in many cases, such land is occupied on the basis of customary rights, for instance, or people make use of it during part of the year for agriculture. And if we talk about communities affected, I think it's also important to keep in mind that there is also sort of members of host communities, of neighboring communities, of these relocation sites who are affected because they lose access to resources, they lose access to land because they do not necessarily have a formal title over the land. It's easy for governments to say, hey, we need this land for the purpose, in the public interest, and we need this land to relocate people. But if there's no adequate legal framework which says how to compensate people who are losing land in such cases, those are the people who lose out. And you need a government involved to sort of help also to be relocated people to find these places and to mediate maybe between these host communities and the new communities. But you also need governments to make sure that they pay proper compensation, and it's not the host communities who basically pay for the relocation of relocated people. And that is what we sometimes see happening in the case of Mozambique, for instance. There is this strong request by the government basically that, hey, we need this land for relocation, and you should be solidary with the members of these relocated communities. And that's a little bit too easy, I think. So when we talk about affected communities, I think it's good to keep in mind that affected communities are both the relocated communities, but also members of the host communities, especially if planned relocation is done well, and if there's efforts made to build back better, for instance, and to sort of transition from humanitarian emergency aid to more development-oriented processes. It also means that maybe relocated communities in the end up being better off than the people who have abandoned their lands for the sake of these people, and who then see the relocated people receiving nice houses, receiving certain benefits, whereas they are excluded because they are not beneficiaries of this relocation project. They are not the victims.
So what I'm hearing here is that in some ways the national level conversation and the role of government administrations can also be to help facilitate those conversations and sort of set the help set in conversation with all these communities the ways in which a lot of these tensions or issues over land rights and fairness essentially are also sort of managed.
Yeah, it's both engaging in it, but also, I guess, making sure that there's a proper process of expropriation, because people who are relocated lose their land, but the people who are hosting, and they also lose their land, and resources, for instance, become more scarce because there's more people competing over access to these resources. And that should, I think, also be taken into account in the process of relocation, expropriation, who needs to receive compensation, because it's not only loss and damage for relocated people. And that is, I think, partly the responsibility of a government to see this and also to cater for it.
Yeah, one strong reason for this need for clear guidelines and frameworks and planning. So maybe I'll an opportunity for Sarah to jump in if you have any additional points to make about national guidelines and frameworks.
Yes, exactly. That's that recommendation number 2 from the policy brief. We've just seen in the research done so far, the evidence and the anecdotes, that it is useful. You can also do relocation without guidance or trying to piece it together from existing disaster risk reduction or housing, land and property or climate laws. But it's really a very good and effective practice what the Fijian government has done with a lot of effort over the last number of years. And we see a lot of potential in learning also for countries within the region and in other regions. We've just heard, maybe staying in the Pacific for a little while, the Pacific leaders endorsed a Pacific regional framework on climate mobility just recently, and it has come out very strongly, maybe as an example also of how other regions and countries see this. Planned relocation or mobility in the context of climate change is really the last resort somehow. The leaders really emphasize the right to stay. This is the big goal, to try and stay. And often planned relocation is the only way of achieving that, to move a little bit internally, to relocate to areas that are less at risk of hazards, that are less easily uninhabitable. And moving a little bit can be a way of not being displaced more forcibly with more implications and trauma and losses and damages associated. We've heard a bit about the national and also now local perspectives. Maybe I wanted to add a bit the global layer, because Sumit also said that many of our colleagues are already on the air to Dubai and about to embark at COP28. And maybe it's a good moment to take a couple of steps back to COP16 that actually happened in 2010 in Cancun, because that gives a bit the global framing, at least in the climate community, about how different types of human mobility are conceived. Because you asked, David, how is planned relocation different from other forms of climate mobilities? So in the Cancun adaptation framework in 2010, there was a recognition of 3 types of movement in the context of climate change: displacement, migration, and planned relocation. And we've seen over the past years that the number of events at conferences of the parties thematizing climate mobility have grown exponentially. There were, in the early days, maybe just 1 or 2 areas to discuss the impact of climate change and disasters on people moving. But now for COP28, you see a high number. I think you can probably spend the entirety of the conference just talking and learning and speaking about different ways of impacts on people's mobility. But the main focus within these discussions is still, I would argue, on displacement and potentially on mobility in the sense of migration or sometimes also immobility, but very little attention so far on planned relocation. And that's interesting. And I think that's partly also because of what we just established. It's such a complex process. It cuts across very different ministerial responsibilities, different policy areas. Some governments, including participants of the Climate Academy, really view planned relocation as a disaster risk reduction tool. I think we have this great experience from Fiji looking at this as a climate measure, but also the points that Caroline made, it's complex from the local level all the way up and back down to the community level. Thank you.
Right. Yes. Thanks. I mean, I think we'll try and cover both directions now in the 20 minutes that we have left. But maybe one way of connecting them is that a lot of the emphasis of the recommendations that were put together in the Climate Academy are about sort of dialogue and consultation and ensuring that the processes that are put in place really leave space for understanding differences in perspective and then accounting for them in the process. So I'll go back now to Sumit in Fiji and Caroline in Kenya. Starting with Sumit, I mean, this question of how the framework can integrate community perspectives and also the perspectives of different communities, as we've heard from Caroline, not just the one being relocated, but their neighbors. How is that? What maybe can you give us a couple of key principles or like the main takeaways from the Fijian experience of how governments can approach and work with communities on planned relocation? Oh, you're still muted.
Thank you, David. The key takeaway is working in partnership between consultation, collaboration. That is helps quite in so many ways, because there's a lot of issues like previously mentioned, land rights, the illegal tenure issues, and how communities are relocated, how the process works. But in any case, Fiji government is to do with partnership, how the approach has been taken throughout. A lot of consultations, a lot of community outreach, a lot of people being discussed right down to the communities. People, the government officials go there, they ask questions, they talk to communities, and this process has been going on continuously. And the government plays a very good role in terms of getting all the interagency governments in line. The mechanism is there, and then the outreach happens, and then the consensus decision making happens, and then at the national level there are policy guidelines that has to be followed, which puts everyone in check. So everything is in check in terms of the proper channels are followed. Everybody is in consultation right through the pre-stage, post implementation stage, and to the post stage. So everything is in sync together, and the standard operating procedures of planned relocation is there that the government has introduced this year is a very they have put the complex issues into very simplified way, to help the relocation process to happen. So we are very blessed to have the document, and it got endorsed this year, and that document is our benchmark. And happy to share the document with the other countries and international level as well. So key takeaways is partnership and also collaboration.
Wonderful. Yes, and absolutely. I'm sure that you get many requests to hear from your experience and see this document that has been created in Fiji. I'm conscious we have 15 minutes left, and but I invite our audience to ask any questions they want, and yes, contributions as well. Frank, we can get to hear from you in a minute before we finish. But Caroline, maybe could you also say a little bit about this relationship between national government and communities? You say a lot of, in Kenya, things are coming up through representatives, but how does that relationship happen at present, and what do you anticipate is needed in terms of policy and relationships with community?
Thank you. Yes, David. Well, basically, I think I just want to take a step back and just say that in Kenya, our 2010 constitution sort of divided roles between the national government and the regional governments, and so disaster management was allocated to counties. So evidently you find the senators who I work closely with come from the counties, and their counties have their own governments. So these mini governments now have their own policy on how to deal with disasters. But evidently the policy making process is still at the national level. So they at the national level are left with the broader way of dealing with such issues. So in my view, from what I've engaged with them, is that we have had a very top-down approach from the beginning, where we are sort of imposing our views on the people, and with time it has become evident that this exclusion of communities has led to really a misaligned relocation effort. And evidently there's, of course, loss of cultural identity and the social disruption that comes with moving people. So positive engagement, it has come to our understanding that there needs to be a positive engagement with these communities. We need to respect their local knowledge and involve communities in this decision making, as Caroline has spoken about, and acknowledging their rights and needs. So therefore, at what is happening presently, we are still having a top-down approach. But I think with what is going on with the flooding situation in our counties and in several areas in several parts of the country, it has become evident that the people know best. But how do we bring what the people know to reflect what policy is all about? Because they in Parliament are the ones who make policies. They're the ones who will pass these decisions. And so we are also entrenching a lot of public participation, though it has become sort of difficult to put it in place, to actually sort of piece it that this is public participation. What do the people want? Mm-hmm. So yeah, we want effective planned relocation, but we also want people to be satisfied with the decision that is going to happen. So it has to become a two-way process. I think it's evident, even if we are not going to, what we're experiencing right now is not a very well coordinated process. It is coming. I don't think, I think as we grow and as we deal with these issues more often, then it will come that involving the people and having a participatory approach is the way to go. Thank you, David. Yeah.
As a necessary condition.
Yes.
For the improvement of their situations. I want also to make sure that we finish with a couple of thoughts about what all this means, maybe in the context of COP28, and I really picked up, I mean, there are opportunities here for exchange and learning, and I expect, for example, the experience of Fiji is very much one that deserves to be shared and discussed and see how it can be applied in other contexts. But maybe I would like to just go around quickly and hear from you if or how you would apply these insights to COP28. Is there anything that any of our audience members attending could go in and request of policymakers who are at the international level? What's needed at that scale at the moment? Sarah, is it okay if I direct that question with you to start?
Sure. It's just around the corner, COP28, so very, very timely. And I think many people have big expectations for this COP for many reasons. There's the global stocktake taking place, and the global goal for adaptation is on the table. But honestly, from the PDD perspective, the main point of interest to watch is really in terms of loss and damage. And the decision that was taken to establish a fund on loss and damage, and to give access also to funding for different purposes and to different audiences. And one of the purposes is migration, displacement, and planned relocation. So relocation is specifically mentioned in that decision that was prepared after the 5th session of the Transitional Committee. So that's a big expectation to really formalize, set up this fund and include both funding for relocation, but also make sure that the fund is accessible for national governments, and also through a rapid disbursement window to local communities. So that's one of the main, I think, advocacy points where we're hoping that the efforts will bear fruit next week. There's a couple of other discussions or messages to drive home regarding loss and damage. I think they're very similar actually to the key insights that we elaborated in the policy brief from the Academy. And maybe I can use that to link up with the question raised in the Q&A. I think somebody is asking about what to do if communities resist the need to relocate and choose to stay. One key message that the PDD is bringing to COP, and that we also have included in the policy brief from the Academy, is really the participation and the involvement of affected persons in everything from planning to assessment to funding decisions. And I think this point, key message number 1, it's really very important to stress, to involve communities and be sure that a need to relocate is not formulated, as Caroline just said, top down, but really something that a community feels, and you can find further information in the academic piece from the Academy, how communities perceive threats, conditions of habitability, can be aligned with technical assessments. Again, I'm using Fiji as a good example. You're conducting a comprehensive risk and vulnerability assessment that includes community voices and perspectives. You include also a perspective on non-economic loss and damage. So we're back at the social and cultural and all these very complex, human relations at the end of the day. So I think the answer, and that's what we need to bring to COP next week, is to involve everyone concerned, increase participation, and then almost negotiate these different steps together through the process. So fingers crossed, and good luck to all of us engaging at COP next week to make these messages.
Yes, and to your last point about the inclusion also in particular of the non-economic losses and damages and considerations, that's really something we heard in so many case studies about a tendency in the absence of consultation for governments around the world to focus on what they do best, which might be the more sort of infrastructural, physical sort of considerations, which in this process is transformed often in consultation. I'll turn over maybe to Caroline, if you have anything to add on this, also since we're on this topic also still of consultation, and this question from the chat about the need to relocate and refusal. And just before you speak, Frank, I see in the chat that you have a contribution, and you have some expertise on this subject matter as well. So we'll invite you to speak briefly after Caroline. Over to you.
Okay, thanks. I should probably also try to keep it brief then. I think an important message to keep in mind, I guess, our whole policy brief resonates the need to engage people in the decision-making process, and that, if people indeed do not want to relocate, there may be a reason for that. And it may be good and it may be useful for governments to learn from each other, to see which stories of success and what works in one context, and see whether that could work in your context as well. But taking into account that local context will also make it maybe more likely that people are willing to relocate. If you relocate people from a fisher livelihood to a place in the bush 60 kilometers away where there's no access to the sea, I can understand that these people resist relocation. Meanwhile, that's what happened in Mozambique. Meanwhile, the government is trying to find a new site close to the sea and still close to the city. I think that will much more likely succeed than the previous relocation, simply because it's better tailored. And if we still feel that relocation is the last resort that is possible, maybe try and talk to people what prevents them from being moved. And it could be because they have a different assessment of the risk, or it could be because simply you're not satisfying the needs they have in the relocation sites. And if you take that into account, have a better understanding of what is going on, basically, maybe you're also able to offer a better solution or a better last resort that is a bit more attractive. I guess that boils down again to community engagement, which this is the
Thank you.
Hello, David.
Hi, Frank. Just 1 second, and I'll hand over to you. Good of you to join us. I just wanted to pick up on one word that Caroline mentioned, which was tailored. And one of the comments I've already received on the policy brief from Tony Oliver Smith, who was also a speaker in our Climate Academy, was very much based on his experience of working in relocations in Panama, was the importance of flexibility and expecting surprises, and that we're running a little bit out of time, but this is I think something that's worth exploring. You know, how these processes can have the space to be tailored and be flexible to context, because the context specificity of plan relocation does boil down often to the local, very hyperlocal level. Not all relocations in a country are the same, I'm sure. Sumit, you might agree with that in the experience of Fiji, but we'll return to that at the end. Frank, we have just a few minutes left, so I'll ask you to make your contribution brief, but you work for the National Disaster Management Organization in Ghana, and you joined us at the Climate Academy as well. And please share the points that you wanted to make today in reaction to the panelists' contributions.
All right, thank you, David, and hi to everyone. It's been a long time.
Hi.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Oh, great. I think my contribution has already been touched upon by all the speakers. I only want to give just emphasis on it by giving some examples that happened recently in Ghana. You know, this planned relocation thing was not something that the national government was looking at it as a policy, but now it has become clear that we need a strong policy on planned relocation because what happened recently in terms of the flood situations when a dam was built and then coupled with heavy rainfall. Now the discussion is all over Ghana that there's something that we need to do as even an organization for the country. So one key point that is coming up is that national governments need to come up with policy, clear planned relocation policy. But then in what framework? So which means that there should be, and I think we have that as one of our key policy points, that there should be a clear legal framework in relation to cultural acceptance, clear legal framework that will talk about collaboration, clear legal framework that will define proper coordination, and clear legal framework that will accept the fact that people have the right to live whatever they want to live. So once we have a policy that will deal with these dynamics, then at least it gives us the opportunity to continue the discussions further. For example, the communities that were affected have now strongly come up saying that they want to relocate on their own. And that has helped even government now to look at the policy. But in Ghana, the law doesn't, government doesn't own land. It is the people, the lands are, the chiefs hold the lands in trust of the people. So the chiefs have released land, large portions of land for government to build and relocate the people on their own. So it's making the conversation even more easier. What we are trying now to do is to make sure that we come up with a policy that will make sure that cultural issues are addressed, collaboration are addressed, and a clear partnership, as the other speaker said, clear partnership is existing between the community and the national government, so that in the end, it wouldn't be like government is imposing anything on the people. So now the conversation is clear. There's clear partnership between the people and the government. What we need to do is to provide the framework, the legal framework, that will make sure that all other issues that have come up are aligned to make sure that everybody is happy.
Thank you, Frank. I think you've managed to bring us back through all of these main points that we covered, or close to it, and it's I don't know if the word is good, but good to hear that there's some very active thinking about this going on in Ghana, and we look forward to more conversations about it. I see we've reached our time, but if our audience will allow it, well, I think we can go around one last time just for a few parting comments from our panelists. Sumit, we didn't have much time to get to the trust funds, but maybe you could say a couple of words about that just to finish. And I'm also thinking at the same time of the loss and damage fund and how you envision the relationship between national and international funding. Maybe too big a question to open up right now, but if you have any comments on this to finish up, I'll hand over to you now, and then we'll go around and hear some final messages. If you have something that you want our audience to take away, I'll ask each of our panelists to say something brief. Sumit, please, a parting word and any comments you have on the trust fund and its role.
Thank you, David. Thank you. It was a pleasure being part of this conversation. Just some parting words, like you mentioned, on the trust fund. So it's a national arrangement that the government has set up through a Trust Fund Act, Crop Trust Fund Act of 2019. And then it works in a way where a certain percentage of a tax money, that is revenue received from a tax money, goes into the trust fund. So it collects. It's the government's way of putting money into the trust fund to ensure that to beef it up, to keep on continuously having the disbursement of money going into the trust fund. And of course, it's an expensive exercise. Relocation of communities is an expensive exercise, and we do look for donors to come in and put money into the trust fund. So spread the word. We have a trust fund, and if there's donors who are interested, please visit our website, in climate change website. I'll share the link. Everything is there about the trust fund. So parting words. Yeah, and again, it was a pleasure being part of the conversation, and anything that you wish to talk about, if I haven't covered, please do ask, and I'll be happy to share with the panelists and the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Sumit. And yes, if anyone wants to be connected with the Climate Academy, do reach out to us. We'll put the Academy's email address, and we can facilitate connections. Next, I'll hand over to Sarah.
Thank you. I'll also make a little pledge, just like you did, Sumit. Maybe just to say, we really need to make sure everything we can, that people can stay where they live and are not forced to move. But unfortunately, it seems to become increasingly inevitable in many places around the world. And so preparing for that is something we need to do well, albeit reluctantly. And at the PDD, we're very happy to help governments who have this interest in the project, both on the assessments, like we heard from Fiji, the finance, the trust fund, these kind of things, and also the establishment of national policies. So this wasn't by no means the last conversation that you moderated on this, David, or organized. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Yes, thanks for joining. Caroline, from the Netherlands, and we'll finish with you, Caroline.
Okay. Yeah, I think what is important in all the complexity that we've discussed and the importance of community engagement, it's also important to keep in mind that it is a long-term process which needs long-term commitment, engagement, resources, and yeah, it's not just about moving people from A to B, basically. And for that, I guess the plea for the loss and damage fund to also allocate money for this, I think it's a very important message for the COP.
Thank you, Caroline.
And thanks very much, David, for your moderation.
Thank you all for being wonderful panelists. And we'll finish with a parting word from Caroline.
Thank you. Wow. I just want to emphasize that planned relocation is not a future scenario. It's actually happening at the moment. So in as much as it can be a sensitive and sometimes politically explosive matter, we need to address it. There are many tensions and hurdles that make successful implementation for planned relocation. And that's why we need to actually look at it in terms of the bigger picture, that this is not necessarily a threat, but a way to look at loss and damage. And it's a way of us, of government and policymakers, to integrate this conversation into their national adaptation plans, their national determined contributions, as well as their disaster risk management policies. So evidently, I don't think this is a last conversation, as my colleagues have said, but it's something that we will continue facing as we continue. So I would just add to read the policy brief and understand what the academy came up with, and see how we can work together towards implementing a successful or sort of a planned relocation plan in place. And with that, I just want to commend Fiji for having a strategy in place, and we are going to learn from it, even as we continue learning from each other. I guess at the end of the day, it is about what works best for our communities and what governments can implement. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline, so much for these concluding words. I don't think I have anything to add, but I will give the opportunity to Renate, if you wish to say anything to close the conversation.
Thanks. Yeah, there's not much to add. Thank you so much for all the contributions during the Academy. Thanks for opening the discussion up to everyone who wants to get involved. I think that's really crucial going forward, that we get everyone interested in working on the topic together to continue the work. And hopefully COP28 will bring some success on the loss and damage fund, and especially in the context of displacement, migration, and planned relocation. And let's keep our fingers crossed. And as everyone has said, this is not the last time we have spoken. So hope to see you soon again. And thanks again for everyone to join. Bye-bye.
Yes. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us, for staying with us a little bit longer than the allotted time. And this is not the last conversation, and the invitation stands. If you'd like to reach out and be in touch, we will very happily facilitate connections. My email and the Climate Academy email are in the chat. Looking forward to the next time we speak. And in the meantime, have a good day ahead of you. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, David, for the moderation.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.